Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Hello, my name is Bettina Swigger, and I have the privilege of serving as the relatively new CEO of the Downtown Boulder Partnership, which is a nonprofit organization that oversees the 49-block Business Improvement District in downtown Boulder. And we advocate for people of all kinds to gather in our public spaces in person. But today, we're going to talk about gathering online. For recording purposes, today is Friday, April 12th, 2024. It is 12 p.m., and this is panel number 17992, titled, Should TikTok Be on the Chopping Block? Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder staff, students, faculty, and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention before we get started is that we want to make sure that you get a chance to ask questions. And so here's how we're going to handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of our discussion for Q&A, and we're using a note card system to receive questions from you all. At any time during our conversation, just raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly. And if you are a student, write that you are a student on your card. When you finish, raise your hand, return it to the producer who will bring it to me, and I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each panelist. For more information, you can find details on the CWA website. Max Towey is the CEO and co-founder of Roca News, which is a digital news company that is transforming the way young people consume news. And if that sounds a little bit vague to you, I encourage you to download the app. It's basically a gamified, super engaging news feed right on your phone. Since its launch in August 2020, it has 4.9 million followers and subscribers across its social media app and newsletter, and it's raised nearly $5.5 million in capital from mission-aligned investors. He also has a following of 735,000 people on his personal TikTok, including yours truly, where he provides informative and comedic material on the news and the 50 states. Before founding Roca News, he was a podcast host and corporate fundraiser at a think tank in Washington, D.C., and he has a finance degree, and he minored in philosophy. John Heffernan is president for the Foundation for Systemic Change, which is a family foundation that supports engagement and media projects that highlight ways to create change and address inequities. He has over 30 years of experience in leadership roles in international development, human rights, rule of law, democracy and governance, humanitarian relief, and post-conflict reconstruction projects in the United States, Africa, South America, Asia, and Europe. He served as executive director of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Speak Truth to Power, director of the Genocide Prevention Initiative at the United States Holocaust Museum, Memorial Museum, and senior investigator with Physicians for Human Rights. There are many other incredible international things on his resume, so we're lucky to have you today for your perspective. Kian Salehizadeh has over 18 years of experience in the investment industry across a variety of roles and focus areas. Most recently, he's served as Vice President of CFO Solutions at LPL Financial, managing a team of outsourced CFOs who help independent financial advisors streamline and grow their businesses. He has a BS and an MBA from the University of California, San Diego. So let's get started. In full disclosure, I've been an avid social media user since the early days of Friendster. Ooh. Callback, if you will. And like many Americans, I joined TikTok during the COVID stay-at-home orders in 2020, and I quickly discovered that it's so much more than just viral dance moves, although those are fun too. For me, the revolutionary TikTok algorithm knew that I was quickly becoming an armchair epidemiologist, and so it connected me to TikTok scientists who were uncovering information and sharing it in real time as they were making discoveries about researching vaccines. It also knew that I was interested in how other nations were handling lockdowns, and so I followed people in China and France and other nations as they followed confusing government directives and navigating life at home in that new reality. Later, when George Floyd was murdered and a racial justice movement was born, TikTok was a place for organizers to share their stories and document the ways people were marching for change in every community, large and small, sometimes even just standing on street corners. And then, of course, there were the recipes, the makeup videos, the lesbians folding laundry, if you know, you know. Under the desk news, and so much more, including these amazing dances and viral songs that transform the way pop music is consumed in our country. So I'm not afraid to admit that I have learned so much on TikTok, from what my attachment style is, to finding new poets, to ways to organize my kitchen cabinets and build pivot tables on Excel. TikTok in its early days especially really felt like the early days of the internet, where everybody had a voice, everybody had equal opportunity to share, nobody was monitoring it or profiting, and it was people connecting to people. For a huge swath of my community, we don't watch TV, we watch TikTok. Recently, the app has undergone a transition, and it's now become a marketplace for everything from gardening tools to cutlery. And also, in full disclosure, I bought the curling iron that I used to do my hair today on TikTok, as well as a moisturizer that I applied to my neck today. So it's become something different. It's turned a little bit more into a QVC kind of a site, and that's been an interesting moment for it. But it's also been facing censorship by United States governments and other, and we're just trying to figure out what to do with this new technology. So I wanted to share my little positive experience with the app, and I'd like to start with some questions for you all about the user experience. Because the user perspective and the freedom of expression offered on this app is pretty important. What are the implications for communities that rely on TikTok for creative expression and outreach? And how do these users perceive the potential banning of TikTok in terms of their freedom of expression? And Max, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming today. This is my first time in Boulder. Absolutely loving it. I'm sure you hear that all the time, but add me to that list. So as you know, this is a fascinating subject because there are so many different angles to it. I think there's a free speech angle, there's a national security angle, there's more of an entertainment generational aspect where young people disproportionately use it, so Congress banning it is viewed as an assault on their information and sort of how they are informed. I think from the user perspective in communities, because the app has become 170 million users. It's grown to 170 million users in the US. Its average age is over 30. I think we all have a picture in our heads of this is the high school dancing app, and it's really, really changed. And so what that entails is tens of thousands of small businesses relying on TikTok for support. And when you really bring that to life, Roca News has benefited from TikTok. We've reached a lot of people with our mission because we're trying to inform young people, and TikTok is the best vehicle to reach new audiences. We've been able to, again, reach this target demographic that desperately needs news, that desperately needs moisturizer and hair straighteners as well. And it's become an incredible platform. And I think that's relevant, that there are ecosystems of users and small businesses that depend on it, because now you'd be yanking away the carpet from underneath them. And I think it's an important tool for news and information. I think it has numerous problems. I think some of the effects of TikTok are dangerous, but I think those effects are either shared or worse from other social media platforms. So I think you can't have this debate in isolation. It's in the context of social media at large. And when we talk about national security concerns, I'd love to look at Google and Meta's record on national security issues and the data they've sold and the fact that they get more user data than TikTok does. So just as an opening statement, I think it's important to realize that there are numerous advantages to TikTok, and I think that whatever arguments used against it needs to also be held for other social media platforms.
That's great. Kian, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so excited to be here and looking forward to chatting about this topic. In full transparency, I will say that I don't actually personally use TikTok myself. But I've been on social media for a long time now. One of the first users when Facebook first came out, so it's been a while. And I agree with a lot of what Max said. I would say, yeah, from a freedom of expression standpoint, 100%, you don't want to take something like that away, especially for the younger generations where they rely on these types of platforms, and not only for creativity, but just in terms of accessing information. The one thing I would just add is, again, with any social media platform, you just have to be careful that you really vet that information and you know that it all is actually accurate, and that's become one of the big challenges as it's grown. But yeah, I'm all in favor. I think just all these platforms, again, especially for the younger folks, it's a way of putting themselves out there. Post-pandemic, it really changed the way a lot of people communicated with others. So for a lot of people, it's just purely social now on the internet, but it can also be a powerful platform to get people together in person, if you know how to use it properly, I would say.
Thanks. It's great to be here. This is my last panel, and which is kind of bittersweet because I love this conference, and this is the third year in a row that I've been here, and I hope I'm invited back next year. So I come from the view of being a human rights activist, which is what I've essentially done for the last four decades. And in full disclosure, I am not an avid user of social media. And I'd like to say it has nothing to do with my gray hair, but perhaps it does have something to do with that. But this is a discussion that needs to be had. This dialogue has to be had in terms of freedom of expression, which of course I'm a huge supporter of. But what I'm concerned, and I don't think you can, like you said, Max, have this the conversation vis-a-vis TikTok in isolation of just social media writ large. But and I'm here to learn more than anything from you guys, is for me, social media, and whether it be TikTok or Facebook or whatever, put in the hands of the wrong people can be very, very dangerous. And one of the things that I noted several years ago, and having worked in the international human rights arena for many, many years, is what happened vis-a-vis the Rohingya population in Burma, and the way that Facebook was used to incite ethnic cleansing there, where hundreds of thousands of people died and hundreds of thousands, millions of people were forced from their country. So it really kind of, that more than anything, great articles in the New Yorker and others that document the use of, in this case, Facebook, and put in the hands of the wrong people the dangers of that. So I'm really eager to have this discussion. And for me, the train has left the station. There's no way, TikTok is there, and I think there's some really valuable parts of it and social media writ large, but I think it really needs to be moderated in a sense and monitored in a sense without violating freedom of expression. But that discussion needs to be had, and because I do think, it's something that's here, but let's talk about what we can do to make it better.
I think that's a fascinating point on how information in the wrong hands or platforms in the wrong hand can lead to terrible outcomes. And you certainly see it with Gen Z that the information well has been poisoned, and I think social media platforms are largely to blame. You look at an issue like Holocaust denialism, 20% of 1829 believes either greatly exaggerated, 20% don't believe it happened, and 23% believe it was greatly exaggerated. That's 43%. That's 2 out of 5 young people, essentially, who are deeply, deeply skeptical about the Holocaust. And when you think about how it came to be that way, I think there are a number of threads underlying that. I know you probably have some great insight there. And I think a big part of it, though, is echo chambers. I am generally going to always side on free speech, but echo chambers and algorithms, echo chambers are created by algorithms where you see more of what you already agree with. And the most extreme takes tend to be elevated. That's why when you log on to Twitter now, X, you'll see fight videos, you'll see the most outrageous takes. When you go on TikTok, you'll see the most ridiculous prank. It's always extreme. And so that's led to this surfacing and elevation of extreme takes. And it's essentially worse than the news media system we have, where 95% of MSNBC's primary viewers are Democrats, 93% of Fox News viewers are Republican, and so you have essentially, you're feeding a consumer base what they already agree with. You don't even really believe what you're saying. You're giving them red meat, what they love, and TikTok does that on steroids, but also other social media platforms do. So I think Silicon Valley needs to be held accountable on echo chambers that are incredibly profitable for them, but costly for democracy and discourse in the country.
Bravo, yes. I want to ask a question about accountability, though, because this is a global platform. And so we're hearing, I mean, from John's point, he doesn't use TikTok. You maybe have a color of hair that might be a different shade from some of our younger TikTok demographic users.
I need to get some hair coloring solution from TikTok.
Yes.
That's the answer, right?
They can
Where's
sell
the
you
Clairol?
But that's also the case of a lot of our legislators who are making decisions about these platforms. And if you've watched any of the congressional hearings, particularly about TikTok, some of them are very entertaining because the people clearly don't know what they're talking about. So I shared a very positive experience of my user experience on TikTok. There's also the dangerous echo chamber and sort of black hole that people can go into with misinformation. So how can we attempt to regulate or hold companies accountable in a global environment? Is this something that the United Nations should be addressing? Should we use financial tools to shut it down? Where do you think the accountability comes from?
But just to clarify, it's not only accountability vis-a-vis the companies that own these platforms, it also with relation to TikTok, it's governments, right? I mean, when you have the Chinese government involved in topic suppression, you know, whether it be talk about Tibet or the Uyghur situation, which is horrendous, and I've used I've worked a lot on that, and there's no mention of this on this platform. It also includes how do we control government that produce this kind of information.
That's the new topic of this panel, is how do we control government?
I think that misinformation is such a difficult topic, and I think it's important that we start there because any simplistic breakdown of it is misleading, in my opinion. I think there are a few reasons why. One is it's always, first of all, institutional distrust is historically high. So who is deciding what misinformation is? Is it Silicon Valley? I mean, we've seen the AI products they've rolled out, Google's Gemini, OpenAI, or now Microsoft's ChatGPT, Elon Musk's Grok. I don't trust Silicon Valley determining what misinformation is. I think it's also been uncovered that they do coordinate with governments, and they don't have the American people's interest top of mind. So do they decide it? Are we outsourcing to tech bros in Silicon Valley doing ketamine and with their views on life extension? I don't know. How about government? I mean, which government? State governments? Which political parties in control? There are so many issues. And frankly, Roka News delivers. We have been a victim of censorship on social media. You know, that's not to be like, oh, poor Roka, but we have seen how these algorithms actually play out. For example, if you use the word vaccine And we're not a whitelisted news organization because Meta shed its news partnership team. So literally the month we were connected with them to become whitelisted so that we could get away with using more hot topics like the Taliban or vaccine or other words that they sort of flag, and then they suppress your post if you're not whitelisted and considered one of their news partners. They got rid of their news partnership team the month we were connected to them. So ever since then, we've essentially been flagged for, if we said Jonas Salk, congratulations, it's the anniversary of the polio vaccine, it would be flagged. It would get a huge fine. More about COVID. We couldn't share our posts. And we've had posts taken down for the most absurd reasons. It's not even ideological. It's just sloppiness for the most part. So we're trying to inform a generation that doesn't get the news already, and this sloppy, poorly applied algorithmic censors go off. It's like a Mission Impossible movie where they start flashing, and most of the times it's false positives. We're not an edgy new. You'll get a post taken down because you're talking about the U.S. exit from Afghanistan. You'll show one picture of the Taliban, and it'll get taken down. And we're trying to inform, but we're not a whitelisted news org. So I just bring it up to say that the misinformation topic is tricky because who's deciding that? That's a tough one.
Yep, I'll just add to that a little bit. 100% agree with that. I would say, I mean, we even see that misinformation is now making its way to those politicians that are making these decisions. I mean, I just read a story the other day that they're even falling for a lot of this because it's gotten so sophisticated. So I think it's a very complicated thing to control. An interesting approach that I've seen with Twitter, it's a platform I've been on for 17 years at this point. So again, going way back, but the whole community note concept is sort of intriguing to me, because then you get other users that maybe are flagging misinformation or just misleading posts, and they have to include supporting facts to explain why they're claiming that it is false. But the challenge is, right, just with the spread of, or the way these things spread on these platforms. Unfortunately, by the time even other users get around to flagging these things, sometimes it could be too late. I mean, who knows how many millions of people have already viewed something before it actually gets noted or flagged.
On the misinformation subject, I'm working a lot right now on the issue of education in this country and the role that some people, well-organized, well-funded people that are playing to convey misinformation about some really critical things that need to be learned, as far as I'm concerned, in our schools. And they're involved in communities throughout this country. They're putting up school board members to support these points. They are threatening fundamental rights of education writ large. I mean, there's something like 200 pieces of legislation, statewide legislation, that have been passed the last couple of years, restricting educators and what they can and cannot teach. This is book banning. This is a lot of different things, and it's led by a lot of misinformation. And I guess the question I have, and it'd be great to hear from panelists, is what role can TikTok and social media play in combating that? Because to me, it takes more than just sort of a brief soundbite to combat this really kind of substantial misinformation that is having a huge impact on this country.
So we're going to control the government, and we're going to fix misinformation.
In which
Who
order?
wants to go first?
Yeah.
Max, I'm going to put you on the spot. So your news platform, you pride yourself on being unbiased.
Nonpartisan.
Nonpartisan. How can you be sure?
Well, I think nonpartisanship requires a few things. First and foremost, it's editorial discipline. Anyone who thinks they can outsource and create a tech platform that detects bias, ultimately underlying all tech platforms and AI systems are human input. So those are not the solution. One thing that helps us stay nonpartisan, and the reason we have a super diverse audience, everyone from Cory Booker to Elise Stefanik and Congress members who follow us, Joe Rogan and Mark Cuban, is that we have a politically diverse audience, so we don't have the incentives that other news organizations have of feeding a base what they already want, even at their detriment, and running the same sort of lowest hanging fruit stories. Like if it's Fox News, migrant crime, and if it's MSNBC covering January 6th every single day and other stories, we don't have those incentives. And I think it's kind of like why Walter Cronkite was able to reach, 6 times all the primetime audiences combined back in his day, is he had the conservative uncle and the liberal niece watching him at the same time. And that allowed him to it sort of set up parameters to be focused. And we also told our audience, you all hate the news. You know it's a charade. You saw the Fox text messages and emails. You know they don't even believe what they say. You know that MSNBC and CNN are playing you as well, and very deeply, deeply ideological with either billionaire backers or corporate overlords. We all know that now. So, okay, you need to accept the possibility that news stories don't reinforce your worldview. They don't feed your confirmation bias. And that ultimately the news cycle can be boring. The 24/7 news cycle that's morphed into entertainment is all about keeping you hooked. Scare tactics, division, all of that. The other side's evil. And so we tell people the news should not be that way. And I think we've had a lot of people buy in, so that's helped us stay between the rails. I also think your format matters a lot, being quick to the point, and that gets to TikTok. TikTok is helpful for that reason. It lacks depth, so we've moved to newsletter and sort of other longer form platforms, our app. So we have a place for that as well. But a lot of young people, we can either get really upset and say young people should have longer attention spans. They should be reading the New York Times all the time. They don't. And they won't anytime soon. And so I think it's important to accept that. And instead of, I think, yanking away a platform that's become a hub of information, is doing our best to populate it with better information and also to hold Silicon Valley accountable. I just, generally speaking, I think we've let 4 of the 5 biggest companies in the world are Silicon Valley tech companies. And if you look at what they've done to political division, the anxiety and depression rates among youth and young adults, if you look at everything they've done, feeding genocides abroad, and fueling dangerous movements around the globe. It's been a terrible report card, and we're just kind of like, yeah, but they're fun and dopamine, yay, and easy to shop on. I think we need to hold them more accountable.
You're here. All right.
Yep. And yeah, just to quickly build on what Max was saying, I think, yeah, a lot of this just goes back to the mistrust as well of the traditional news outlets nowadays. So I think the only way you're going to really get to a point where the younger generation is getting information accurately and consistency is to have more platforms like that where they're ensuring that. So once again, you can earn that trust from these younger users, because I think just based off of the information that's circulating out there, whether it's all accurate or not, ironically, right, I just don't think a lot of people trust those, like CNN, MSNBC, Fox. So they need something that they can depend on.
And it's good to know that you're offering a long form option like that. From the accountability perspective, I'd like to also look at it from sort of to turn the coin upside down. What concerns me, other than social media platforms being put in the wrong hands of folks that are doing things like fomenting genocide in Burma, is how this is such an incredible tool that can be used for activism around the world, and it has been. But I don't believe that it can be used in isolation and in a substitute for real, let's say, grassroots organizing. Because at the end of the day, I think that kind of superficial activism is not going to stick. So you have people that use Instagram or TikTok or Facebook to promote an idea that needs to be promoted or protect, someone's human right. But it's this kind of superficial, shallow advocacy that doesn't hold that person accountable. They go on to something else, and they feel like, okay, I've done this. I'm an activist. I'm an advocate, without any real substance behind it. And I think, and you guys probably know more about them. I remember reading about Arab Spring and particularly related to Egypt, that you had this wonderful activism around getting rid of this incredibly repressive regime that was responsible for killing thousands of people, and it was really led by Facebook. And there was, and they deserved great accolades, but regrettably, there was nothing behind it. So now you have that regime that was there before return to power in Egypt. So I just would love to find a way that you could, kind of marry the idea of using social media as an activist platform, combined with this kind of grassroots, door-to-door, so to speak, person-to-person advocacy that's going to have more of a impact on real systemic change versus those quick fixes.
I'm curious if anyone on the panel has thoughts on this, but one aspect of the TikTok ban that I think is important, especially in the eyes of Americans, young Americans, is the optics. We've had a number of pushes to ban TikTok off and on, and it always seems to ebb and flow based on lobbying spend and also the issues of the day. It hasn't changed over the last few years since the first proposal came to the floor was the security risk of the Chinese Communist Party, and this, which is the stated reason generally for banning it. So why would it then ebb and flow? And then most recently, the House passed the TikTok for sale bill, I think 352 to 65, which is just staggering. They couldn't pass today as a Friday bill today with that kind of support. So I think that's fascinating and also a little concerning. I've seen just individual Congress members flip on the issue, and then you sort of trace the dark money of TikTok and their advocacy. And it just creates, I think, a level of distrust. And frankly, although I think young people are terribly, terribly, terribly misinformed on Israel-Palestine for the most part, I think the polling on young people's views kind of spurred this latest push based on the rhetoric around the bill. So I'm just curious if you all have thoughts on the optics of the timing here.
So I'll just chime in on that a little bit, and just to make my position clear, I'm by no means in favor of banning it. I'm actually an advocate for divesting it just because of the fact that it is linked at the end of the day to the Chinese government. But I would say, politicians in general are very hypocritical. A perfect example, not to make a political statement here, but the Biden campaign, right? They came out and said, we're in favor of this, but at the same time, we're going to keep campaigning and promoting our platform on TikTok until it's banned, right? So you can't really have it both ways. If you want to make a stand, then you gotta be all in. I totally agree with that.
One could say that's all about politics, having it both ways, right? It's all about hypocrisy writ large. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, there's also so much money involved, too. When we're talking about accountability, we're talking about government policy. Follow the money. I think TikTok is currently valued by their company ByteDance as like $280 billion. That's a self-evaluation. But how does this compare, and what is the overall economic impact of a platform like that versus, say, YouTube, Twitter, now X, Facebook, et cetera?
I think it's still much, much smaller, but I think it is funny to bring up the money issue because although ByteDance is the parent company, some of the largest owners of TikTok are U.S. investors. The Carlyle Group, the largest private equity group in America, Susquehanna Group, which is whose head is a guy named Jeff Yass, I think the second biggest donor of the Republican Party. And so there's a lot of money involved with TikTok, and it's kind of funny because those are very establishment interests, and it's kind of being kicked out by the establishment. So I think the for sale aspect, everyone should be paying close attention to who gets it. I think that's relevant. You don't need a tinfoil hat to have questions about why the push is happening now and whose interests are at stake here. Steve Mnuchin is angling for, is putting some bidders together to buy it. So anyways, I think the money aspect is really, really, really important. And I think in DC, they make you look like a crazy person, ask these questions when increasingly that city feels bought and paid for. I know that's probably an old take to people who've seen politics for a while, but I'm just learning it.
Let me just ask a question, you guys might know this, but the politicians that are supporting a complete ban, is it just a ban on the ownership of TikTok, or TikTok writ large, or what?
It's a forced sale of TikTok to a U.S. company, and it would have to happen within 6 months of the ban. But the interesting thing is what it would do if they don't sell it is you could keep it on your phone. They couldn't wipe it from your phone, but Apple's App Store and Google's Play App Store would have to delist it, I think. So you couldn't get new up. It would be a slow death. The app would stop working on your phone over time. So no more dance videos, unfortunately.
I have so many questions. Okay, if we have 170 million users of TikTok, how does that, I want to talk about the numbers a little bit more, how does that also combine with other social media platforms, right? Like we went from Friendster to Facebook, or from Friendster to MySpace to Facebook to Instagram to Twitter. There's always going to be a new one coming. So would it make more sense to do some kind of international, let's invest in media literacy and how to understand where our information is coming from, rather than try to immediately or react to a situation and shut down a company that is just trying to make money and it'll be the next one's going to come along?
Oh, you would have much more insight on what international body might fit best here, but I think generally institutional distrust is so high. The UN, I don't know if a lot of people would trust their oversight. You know, I as long as polarization is as severe as it is and distrust of DC institutions is so high, I just think a lot of young people are going to roll their eyes. And young and old, I mean, on both sides of the aisle, I think a lot of people are just going to say, oh yeah, international governing body, yeah, these don't have any corruption and ideological underpinnings. Yeah, no, they do.
And or do they have enforcement power?
Also,
I mean, I think that's something really, I mean, certainly in terms of, you know, the world that I live in, international justice and so on and so forth. It's great. We all want international justice, and we all support things like the International Criminal Court that I've worked on. But at the end of the day, is there any sort of enforcement mechanism in which is, you know, a real concern?
Yeah, and I'll say, yeah, I mean, the media literacy thing is an interesting angle. You know, it sort of ties in with a panel I did yesterday on personal finance for the younger generation, and that's a perfect example. I mean, there's a whole lot of talk out there and just jokes out there on other platforms around, you know, what they say TikTok financial advice, because it's just so prevalent, and so many people, I think, fall for the misinformation that's out there. So at a smaller, I guess, or different scale, right, even with financial literacy, I think that makes a big difference in terms of if you can educate people at a young enough age, then maybe, and again, I know misinformation campaigns are becoming more sophisticated, but maybe that'll at least help a little bit in terms of just knowing what to trust or not trust. But even then it goes back to, you need to have the right individuals that are helping teach this to people at a younger age and doing it in an effective way. And even sometimes that becomes a challenge.
It seems to me that, and you guys say I'm nuts, but if there's a real emphasis on education in terms of media literacy and so on and so forth, starting from a very young age, that eventually, and this may be completely idealistic, but eventually there will be kind of some self-correcting mechanism in a method or platforms that are completely democratizing journalism writ large. You would think that people that are exposed to this type of education from a young age would weigh in and could perhaps provide that sort of guidance that would, there's always going to be bad actors, but
At risk of sounding like a, tacky inspirational speaker, I do think that so many of the problems we discussed this week are secondary to more primary questions of a cultural revival, a spiritual revival in the country, where if you don't have the will to change or the will to fix this, and if division's so severe, all of this feels secondary. Issues of trust. How do you fix that? I mean, look at the fights on the school boards right now, and I think both sides culpable. Not to suggest at an equal level, but I think a lot of Americans saw the COVID restrictions in school and thought they were a little ridiculous. My nephew is in school in Northern Virginia, and they, made them wear masks last week. That seems a little out there. I think a lot of parents don't share those values. They've seen the educational and social costs of that over the last few years. And that's just the kind of issue of, okay, are schools teaching media literacy? How do they dub trustworthiness of different platforms? So I think there are all these questions that are kind of like, as long as we're as bitterly divided as we are, and so cynical and anxiety and depression as high as they are, it just feels all secondary to those issues. Yeah.
That resonates with what I've been hearing at the conference too. I mean, there's this comment about how we no longer have a shared culture. You referenced Walter Cronkite, right? Sometimes I feel when we talk about social media, it must have been the same way people felt when the Gutenberg press was invented, and suddenly we could disseminate information in a more accessible way if you knew how to read. So how do you teach people how to read? That took many centuries, and still we have people on planet Earth who do not know how to read. So I think we're pushing ourselves to make a decision really quickly about this, but it's also unfolding in real time. So as you look ahead to, let's say, dare I bring it up, the 2024 presidential election, what can we expect in the next 6 to 8 months on these social media platforms? And do you think that potential regulators will be using that as a way to move forward?
Well, it's interesting to see Meta's changes in the last few years. They now take off, maybe do a fault. They used to delete virtually 0 posts, and I'd have to check the number, but they are now taking down a ton of posts from either anonymous users or accounts tied to international actors of sorts. I think it'll be interesting to see how the domestic threat unfolds with misinformation this election. Deep fake technology. I think a lot of young people, especially on TikTok, actually, if young people are good at one thing, it's detecting deep fakes. I think they're actually much better prepared for that threat than, say, Meta users. Facebook and Instagram for the most part. I think the continued elevation of the most extreme takes and the whole structure of social media is concerning. I think that's poisoning the well more than anything. In what world does a milquetoast, moderate take rise to the top of a very loud platform? It would never. It would never. So I'm concerned about the more broader structural issues of social media, and it sounds like we were just interviewing the AI person at Harvard who's nicknamed the security guru, and he was talking about he thinks the domestic threat is going to be the biggest concern. Just a bunch of people paid by campaigns or shady money to just disseminate a bunch of memes and out of context videos.
Yeah, no, I'll add, yeah, exactly. I think, again, it goes back to it's very difficult once these are already out there and they've grown the way they have. I mean, outside of just complete censorship and, taking everything down. As an example, I think Threads said they were doing that at one point, or maybe they did, which is part of Meta's platform. They just said, yeah, we're going to either stop promoting or showing any kind of political content whatsoever. I mean, that's not great either, because then you're no better than anywhere else. But yeah, it's difficult because, yeah, there are the deep fakes. It doesn't cost a lot of money now, and it doesn't take a lot of resources, as we've seen with some of even these robocalls and other things. So it's going to be very difficult unless people are just educated beyond these platforms, or they have some sort of stance already. yeah, it's just, I think it's going to get harder and harder to parse what is the truth from what is not.
You know, it just strikes me that, you know, again, media literacy I think is really important and key, but I think there's this fine balance between achieving this sort of level of where the consumer understands, you know, what they're reading or what they're learning or what they aren't learning, and a complete distrust that can be based on paranoia real large, and so I think there has to be this balance that you just don't, you know, that it's just automatic that you are skeptical about what you read is not real or whatever, and because I think that can just talk about, you know, emotional issues writ large, and which will affect every part of your life.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. I think there's an opportunity too for us to recognize that social media is just one of the ways that we communicate. And I was looking at the audience when you're talking about deep fakes being more easily detected by young people, and the young people in the audience were like, yep, we're skeptical. We see this. So I think that can give us some hope. This can be a little bit of a gloomy conversation. So let's think about TikTok as a tool for activism, a tool for bringing people together. And I'm going to take some questions from the audience now. So Max, this is for you. Have you or Roca News ever been asked to promote or avoid certain topics or stories? And if so, who did the asking and what topics?
Oh, that's a great question. We've had only recently, I think after, you know, as word has gotten out a little more, we've had different groups reach out, partisan groups. Recently, a super PAC affiliated with Biden, and they'll bring up an issue, I can't even remember what it was, and they'll say, have you looked into this story? We're looking to get it out there. And we've had, I mean, I guess it depends on who's asking. In terms of that's kind of more, you know, an organization. There are some issues that are just impossible, and you're going to get a lot of flack from both sides. Obviously, Israel-Palestine is number one on that scoreboard. But yeah, I mean, we've in terms of the social media platforms, which I think is most relevant to this conversation. Oh, we've had a number of posts taken down, and
because
I'll give you an example. One was we did a story on. There's a study that has since been peer-reviewed and is now accepted that Viagra leads to a reduce in the risk of Alzheimer's long-term. And that was one of the stories we had. And so we sometimes make playful covers that kind of catch people's attention on feed. So we used a famous picture of Albert Einstein on the chalkboard, and instead we had him writing Viagra. And that was taken down because it was promoting a prescription drug, which we weren't. Another one is, again, I've mentioned multiple times now, if you do a history of, say, Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or any group, I promise we're not promoting them. They'll take it down because you show a militant group. And because we're not a whitelisted news org, the censors are a little stricter for us. So we've had a bunch of, the vaccine's a huge one because if you say the word, we now put an asterisk in there. It'll affect people's ability to share your posts. And again, it would be any vaccine. We could talk about the measles vaccine and say childhood vaccination rates went down. It would get the COVID flag and you lose your ability to share. So there are a lot of censors that are set up today that frankly, again, are more sloppy, and you'll have posts restored. TikTok takes down posts all the time. So it is concerning to see, again, the kind of pretty lame and underwhelming enforcement of their content moderation policies. So it's like less evil and more just dumb, frankly. That has been a surprise. I used to think you'd have to be like InfoWars to get censored, or someone who's just crazy out there, and that's not the case.
So, but Max, I question the Viagra example, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Who's asking to take down? Who's doing the asking?
Instagram. It'll flag it, it'll take it down, and it'll give you a reason. It'll say, read our community guidelines, 800 pages, and then it'll be note prescription drug section.
Huh. Interesting, yeah.
And that happens a lot. I mean, it's, again, they have a tough job. Content moderation's tough because a lot of these issues we're talking about, but the problem is once you set up these guardrails, there are a lot of false positives.
So then would it be better to have no guardrails at all?
That's where it gets tricky. Do you want 4chan? No, we don't. So I think it's imperfect. I agree. I think community notes, say what you want about Elon Musk's Twitter. I think it's deteriorated in a number of ways. I think the algorithm has elevated weird fringe content. But I think community notes is a great invention.
What is that?
If you tweet basically that, I don't know, that Nancy Pelosi believes Michael Jordan is better than LeBron James, and then it turns out that she's actually said, she's never spoken about this, I don't know why that came to mind, but, and then...
Actually, it's the other way around.
No, but and if you could cite that she said the opposite, you could put it as a community note, and then it would get upvoted. So it's still imperfect, it's more of the people, but there have been a number of prominent tweets that are just wrong, and people will quote and link to a source at the bottom. So it's a pretty good system that's more people-based, still imperfect, but good, which we need to get used to saying, imperfect, but good. Because right now we have a lot of imperfect and bad.
It's
Sort
a
of
lot
like our democracy, right?
Yeah, I'd say it's a lot more effective, again, than having these organizations try to enforce it, right? Because then you have the entire population or user base that's keeping an eye on these things.
I mean, this might not be a popular take. I also believe that more extreme beliefs is a result of speech restriction often, or a sense that the establishment's against you and there's this big brother reality in America. So I think, frankly, even though you might be tempted to see these crazy theories elevating, I think their solution is not to clamp down more. That's one reason why look at the most popular podcasts. They are not establishment podcasts anymore. That's the result. And again, you might say, oh, to stop that, we need to say more no to that. I don't believe that. I actually think there needs to be a little more laissez-faire.
Let's take another question. Specifically for TikTok, so let's take away all social media in general. Is it more dangerous for China to own TikTok than for it to have American or some other country own the company?
So my take on it is yes, but only from the standpoint of, we know that China will probably try to utilize some of the data that they get from this for malicious purposes. As Max and John have also spoken about, I don't agree that any of the platforms are doing a great job with this. There's data privacy issues abound across all of these. I mean, we know that Meta, other platforms are doing the same thing, but at least, I would say I'd much more rather have the US government at least have access to this data versus a foreign actor and you don't know what they might end up doing with it. We already know that they've censored individuals as a result. Who knows what sort of information maybe they can glean just from people's posts. And again, I know that's a slippery slope as well, but that's my take on it.
I'd like to think that in a democratic system where there's a series of checks and balances and a culture of resistance, that it would be better placed in the US than it would be China.
I think, just to go back to this point, and again, I wish I had better ideas or had heard better ideas about the solution side of things, but I think understanding the problems obviously the first step and really, really important. If you look at so many problems in our country and society today, so many of them trace back to big tech. And we've just sort of put our hands in the air and said, oh, well, that's the system we have, and I like funny cat videos, and we accept the status quo. But I think the data, Gene Twenge's research on have smartphones destroyed a generation, about the impacts on the mental health and the community aspects for Gen Z, and it's been abysmal. Jonathan Haidt has a new book on the anxious generation, I believe it's called. I think you look at our political issues, big tech. It's like, I know correlation does not equal causation, although they proved, I believe, some causal links. But the surge in in pessimism about the U.S. future and the deterioration of race relations. So many of the biggest issues in the country, the breakdown of dating. Dating's in a terrible spot right now. Dating apps sound all great, but they've ruined, young people are in fewer relationships than ever, and it's in a dismal spot. It's actually made it less equal, even though you think it would be more equal, but fewer people have partners that are under 35 than ever. So, okay. We have all these issues that seem to trace back to big tech, and I think we've let it, and they're the biggest companies in the country. They're making a killing at our expense, a killing. And I'm surprised there's not more. Well, they're the biggest spenders. Google's the biggest spender in DC right now. So I don't think it's as simple as because they spend a lot, there's no scrutiny. I think it does need to happen from the ground up, and we just have to at least be aware of what they've done to us. I think it's stunning.
This is great. I love to ask you a question. Sorry, Bettina. I don't want to play the moderator role, but I have 3 kids in their 20s, right? And then they each handle social media in such different ways. Particularly, even a 5-year age difference is, one is kind of focused on Facebook, and one never uses Facebook. One uses TikTok. One got off TikTok because it was sort of controlling her life, and she said, I have to get away from that. And it's just interesting to me that and then you hear, even in Silicon Valley, you hear of some schools, I think it's Palo Alto High or whatever, that has really kind of focused on removing kids from any kind of social media. These are the kids of the people of the big tech industry you would think they know, right? So do you think that there is a growing movement among Gen Z and whatever the other gen is below them to kind of resist that and just get off social media writ large? And
I think it's a fascinating question of separating the noise from the actual trend line, because it reminds me of the articles. You'd see it in the New York or the Atlantic, the New York Times, it'll be like, the new sober generation, because there are a surge of non-alcoholic bars in Portland, Denver, and New York. And so they'll say, oh, wow, Gen Z's not drinking as much. And then you see the data from the last few years, and they're actually drinking more. So I think it's always important to separate the noise from the trend line. In terms of getting off social media, I do think there's more awareness, which is a wonderful thing. I know a lot of people who, there's a real popular trend to at least go on these dopamine fasts where you're off social media for a month or so, but it can overtake your life. I think the framework of digital fentanyl, as extreme and scary as that term is, it's real. It is real. They are good at what they do. And the Silicon Valley thing, Palo Alto High School, it just feels like drug dealers not doing their own drugs, and again, everybody else, but they say they're great to other people. Again, it's like Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates is very anecdotal. None of them let their kids use iPads, or obviously Bill Gates' kids are older, but I remember he had very stringent read a lot rules. So the people who, again, are behind the curtains understand what the impact of their work is.
Do you think there's a little bit of Hanlon's razor here, where we shouldn't mistake for malevolence what really is just ignorance? And I'm speaking not about Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, but I'm speaking about maybe the person who wrote the code that created the algorithm that now creates digital fentanyl addicts, which is a term I had not heard before and is terrifying. Maybe it's just like you birth this thing, it's out in the world, and now what do you do? I
totally agree. I think that, I don't know who's seen Oppenheimer in here, but I think it's an incredible parallel to Los Alamos is the equivalent today, I think, is Palo Alto. And I don't believe there are a lot of evil people. I think there are some evil actors involved in bad cultures that have led to some of these outcomes. But I think a lot of the individual people are simply creating opening Pandora's box, and we sort of, reap the consequences. But I agree. No, I don't think it's a bunch of evil people in the lab as is depicted, a bunch of reptilians making smartphones that control us. I don't believe that at all. I think the culture and sort of the consequences need to be studied. I agree. I think that's an important point, though. Also shouldn't vilify everyone who's, touched JavaScript before, that they're evil.
Yeah, no, I've, just to add to that, I've got several friends who work at Meta, Twitter, or X, other platforms, and I keep in touch with some of them, and, it's interesting how many of them now tell me that they even regret to a certain extent, being part of building these platforms to where they are today, and they kind of wish that it hadn't gotten to this point. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of that too. So I think it also causes a lot of anxiety for the people that are involved, from the ground up.
Do you have any thoughts from the global?
It's just friggin' scary. It's like all of a sudden your kid's a teenager, right? You had great control, and then boom, what do you do, right? I mean, it's about establishing parameters and guidance and all that kind of stuff. But as I said, the train has left the station, so let's figure out how to work with it.
Right. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'd love to take. Is there one more question that's coming? 10 minutes left. Oh, excellent.
10,
we can
yay.
solve this problem.
2 more questions.
2 more questions. So we've been talking a lot about Silicon Valley. We've decided that maybe they are not mustache-twirling evil villains in a silent film. But how can we hold them accountable, and what kinds of guardrails can we put in place for future social media platforms that are developed so that we don't get so out of control?
First of all, I think mustaches are great things. My mom doesn't agree, but yeah, I think they're probably, I imagine John has much better historical context and insight here, but I think a lot of the public health awareness campaigns that have succeeded take time. I think that people like Jonathan Haidt are doing an amazing job. I also think there should be multiple perspectives, if nothing else, to empathize with, again, people who work at these companies, not treating them like they're making poison, intentionally at least. So I think this campaign will take a while to unfold. I am glad I'm not a parent. This seems like an impossible issue. One of the fascinating things Jonathan Haidt talks about is you have a really bad social dynamic where every member of, say, a 6th grade class would be better off if nobody had social media, but if you're an individual kid in that 6th grade class, you are worse off if you don't have it and everyone else does. So there are really bad group incentives where you're kind of out of the mix and you're an outcast, and it's hard to be the outsider and weird and, he's Amish, like that vibe. So I think that there are a lot of dangerous dynamics. And it'll take time, but I think conversations like this are important. And I think a greater awareness of mental health, which we've made a ton of progress on, is critical, because these are amplifiers of all the bad demons we have.
Yeah, and I'll add, it's definitely not going to come from the political side of things as far as holding these platforms accountable, because that just, you see the news all the time about political hearings for this and that, and that's been going on for years and years, and I think it's all, for the most part, it's just a farce or a facade where they do it just to say that, we're playing our part. I think it comes from the user base, right, eventually becoming aware enough to hold them accountable. A lot more grassroots efforts. It's ironic, right? People try to utilize the same platforms to educate people why they're not great, and so that's not necessarily effective either. But at the end of the day, it takes time.
I agree with all that, and I also think that storytelling is really, really important in terms of bringing about real, thoughtful, systemic change. And like anything, you hear the negatives more than anything else. And if there's a way to kind of uplift and highlight those positives that come out of TikTok and other social media platforms, and I think that's really critical, because then you get people talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another audience question, which I wonder a lot too, is if skepticism about the platforms is growing, why are the platforms also still growing?
They're unbelievably good at what they do, which is suck up our attention. They're the best. So I think this is where I think the government intervention question is fascinating, because even though there's low trust and a lot of sketchy motives involved, at the end of the day, the government did have to clamp down on big tobacco, and it took time, but they did. their ability to advertise, reach younger consumers. There was government intervention. Now, why I think that parallel isn't perfect is because free speech is so involved. Nobody has the right to nicotine buzz, but we do have the right to free speech. And so I think that's where that parallel gets a little murky. But in terms of usage, I think it's not surprising at all that it's grown. It's ever accessible. It's also got a network effect where if you're in a friend group and 3 of your friends are on it, you may not join 4 but 6 now you're on. So that's why they do balloon to similar like market share. So that's how we got to 170 million Americans. And they're, again, utterly addicting. They optimize for everything. The attention dilemma, or the social dilemma documentary is unbelievable, I think, at investigating how they do it and sort of the philosophies that enable it.
Yeah, the social pressure aspect of it, I would say, is a huge reason for that. And then it's also just seeing it in other media platforms. Even I've had friends who've done similar thing where they do a social media fast for a while, and they kind of tell themselves, okay, I'm just going to leave altogether, and then sure enough, a month later they're back on there because you just can't escape it anymore.
Gained all that weight back. Right?
Yep.
I remember. Sorry, John.
No, I was just, what was I thinking about? That, again, the whole idea that there's so much negative stuff out there that if there's some way to highlight, I mean, the tobacco analogy I don't think is totally an apt one because I can't think of anything positive about tobacco other than the fact that it made
Feels good.
a lot of people a lot of money at one point. But in terms of its health, repercussions,
True.
whereas, there's a lot of positive stuff about social media, and I think that's the kind of stuff that we need to focus on.
That's a very fair point. I took a 6-month coffee break, and I had read a Michael Pollan book about caffeine, and you kind of forget it's a powerful drug. 6 months, and then you have a coffee first time back, and it's like a psychedelic, energetic, what's going on experience. I had the same with TikTok. I took a long break.
Yeah.
I gave it up for Lent, and for any kind of Irish Catholic, and got back on it and was like, oh, this is what it feels, and it's a powerful platform. So I do think, but you're right. There's a lot of good that comes out. I feel like I'm kind of pro keep TikTok, but I've been very negative toward it. I think it has a lot of advantages, but that's a good thing. And
It's been really interesting because I entered this conversation the complete opposite as you, and now we've sort of reversed position. Maybe, there's not much space between
We've
us
switched
anyways,
places.
Yeah.
That's what happens at the Conference on World Affairs. All right, we've just got about 2 minutes left, so if you can take 45 seconds and sum up all of the things we talked about today, what would you like to leave our audience with today? Let's start with you, John.
Just as I said at the very beginning, I said, no, I mean, the title, should it be on the chopping block? No, it shouldn't be on the chopping block. The train has left the station, and let's figure out how to make it work for us.
Yep. Yeah, I'll say, they're great platforms if you know how to use them the right way and use them for good. So yeah, definitely I'm not in favor of getting rid of it altogether, but it's going to take time, and we do need to figure out a way to just improve them.
I think that the solution to many of our country's problems start at the lowest level. They start at individual level, then the family, then the community. And I think the solution to these problems is not going to come out of Palo Alto. It's not going to come out of Washington, D.C. I think it requires a cultural awareness that will lead to more lasting change. And I think that if we focus at the top levels instead of the bottom levels, we won't reach that change. And so I think all these issues, that these conversations are part of the solution, and that I think also having an overall optimistic bent is absolutely necessary to have the will to change.
So it's on you, Boulder.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all of your thoughts. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you, Bettina.
Thanks.